What? Are you kidding? We got us an awesome podcast here.
Welcome back to another exciting adventure of Rethinking Revelation. I'm your host, Travis Finley. This is episode 88, part 2, continuing my interview/discussion/Q&A session with David King. Enough of all that. Let's get back to it.
I just lost it. Here it is. Deuteronomy 32, 28, and 29. They are a nation void of counsel, and there is no understanding in them. If they were wise, that's totally Jesus' ministry, preaching to the wise, right?
Right.
If they were wise, they would understand this. They would discern their latter end.
Their latter end, yeah, in the first century.
You know?
Yeah.
That it's all about the culmination of the story. So what ends up happening is that the this is my metaphor for the story, and the story is the yellow brick road leading to the Emerald City. Okay, the Old Testament is the yellow brick road, the New Testament is the Emerald City, and we have a picture in the New Testament of those who leave the yellow brick road because they see that it's not the end, it's not the goal. But that's what the Pharisees and the scribes have done. They want to stay on the yellow brick road because they have made the means the end. They have messed up the storyline. So they understood full well what Jesus was saying. Jesus was saying the end of the yellow brick road has come, and if you don't leave it, you're going to find yourself on the outside. And then you've got the parable in my mind that comes of the son of the vine dresser, where the vine dresser owner sends his son, right? He sends his servants, and they beat them and kill them, and he says, well, surely I'll send my son and they will respect him. And that's Jesus. He comes and says, Jesus is saying the harvest has come, and the vine dressers are like, we're not going to harvest these. We like to eat them ourselves. We're not going to harvest them and sell them to the, you know what I mean? I'm just mixing my metaphors now, but that's basically what they're doing. We're not going to do with your vineyard what you intended us to do with the vineyard. And in order for us to secure the fact that we can keep these grapes for ourselves, is we're going to kill the son. We're going to kill the messengers. So that is staying on the yellow brick road. You're supposed to leave the yellow brick road. So the way that I say it is that the Pharisees knew that the story was supposed to end. They all knew it. Psalm 102 shows us that the story had an end. And they knew it. But they didn't want the story to end. And they didn't want the ending that the story was supposed to bring. So that's what the whole wedding feast is about. That's what the whole harvest is about. That's what the rich man and Lazarus is about. That's what the parable of the lost son is about. The shrewd manager. All of those are about the same thing. It's about the end of the story and how and whether or not you are a participant in that positively or negatively. But if we don't know Deuteronomy and we don't have this information of the end, we're not going to know what in the world is going on in the gospel.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to move on to the phrases, like the key verses that you'll hear people try to send help?
Yeah.
Okay. So first one is, fear the one who can cast body and soul into Gehenna. Is body and soul an idiom, or is it actual physical body and then this ghostly being? So
Is this Matthew 10?
I can look it up real quick. Bodies.
I'm trying to think. I don't have that off the top of my head. Yeah. So it's Matthew 10:26 and following. Do not fear those who can kill the body but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. There you go.
There you go.
There it is.
Yeah.
There it is right there, right? So the trick with translation is all translation is interpretation. So when we are not reading the original language, it's being filtered to us, and so that can be good and that can be bad, positive and negative. So the term for soul is suke, and the problem with that translation of soul is in other passages it's translated as life. So I'm trying to think of the other one. I'm trying to think of the one where Jesus says, "You fool." It's the parable where Jesus is talking about the guy who was rich and he stored up all of his treasures in his barns and whatnot. And God says, "You fool, tonight your life is required of you." It's the same word, suke. So is it life or is it soul? And if it's soul, is it a metaphysical, eternal entity that can't be destroyed? You know what I mean? And if it is soul, and if it is a metaphysical entity that can't be destroyed, then what help is it to translate it in other passages as life? That's not helpful.
Right.
And in my opinion, there's no way of saying, well, no. Translate it the same way each and every time. But even then, if we translated it as soul, people still think of that as a metaphysical entity that cannot die. But when we read of there were 10 souls in that city, so there were 10 disembodied spirits in that city? No.
Right.
We're talking about people. So I tend to favor the idea and the connotation that suke is an idiom for a person, his life, his life really. I think life is a good translation. So rather fear him who can destroy both body and soul in hell. And I don't have the Greek text in front of me, but I would guesstimate that the word for hell in the Greek is Gehenna. Yeah. And so that right there opens up an interpretive issue for us to consider. What is Gehenna? And if we look at an historical contextual dictionary or encyclopedia of biblical terms, we'll find out that Gehenna is actually a physical location. So then the question then becomes, well, so what justification do we have for changing it from a physical location into some spiritual, metaphysical place? Mm-hmm. And what is that metaphysical, spiritual place like? Is there anything in this text that tells us? No, I don't think so. It just says hell. So how do we even know what it is and what it's like? So then we would have to go back from Matthew 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 and find out if there's any description of what this hell is like. But in my opinion, again, we're talking about the meta-narrative. We're talking about So if we think about John the Baptist coming on the scene in Matthew chapter 3, and he says to the scribes and the Pharisees, "You brood of vipers," right? What is the context for him using that term? Why does he use that term? I think the whole Old Testament should already have prepared us for that, and especially as we saw, and you mentioned that you made that connection from Deuteronomy 32, that those terms there of poisonous animals and whatnot, having an association with people rather than animals. But the context that John the Baptist says to the scribes and the Pharisees, you brood of vipers, who warned you from the wrath that's coming, from the coming wrath?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So what's the context for that? What's the coming wrath?
Yeah.
And I've asked pop evangelicals this, and Reformed seminary professors, and they'll tell me he's talking about hell. And I'm just like, oh my word, you're a professor in a seminary, and
yeah,
you have no clue. You have no clue about the meta narrative. But they think the meta-narrative is ultimately about the spiritual realm. These are just physical stories that we have to go beyond and see that there's something behind it. But I just don't see any justification in the text to do that. So here in Matthew 10, we're talking again about Jesus saying, have no fear of them. So he's talking to his disciples. He just told his disciples he's sending them out as sheep to the wolves, and they're going to come after you. But don't be afraid of them, because, so here's something interesting. We have to read between the lines. We have to squint with our eyes as we read the Bible to see what's really being talked about. And in Matthew 23, Jesus says to the scribes and the Pharisees the opposite of what he says to his disciples here. Jesus says to the scribes and the Pharisees, I'm going to rain down upon your heads all of the judgment and vindication on the righteous blood shed from Abel to Zechariah, the son of Berechiah. But not only those, I'm also going to send you my own messengers, and you're going to kill them too. Okay, so what Jesus is talking about in that scenario in Matthew 23 is righteous judgment and vindication on wicked murderers of God's prophets. Okay? But here in Matthew 10, we have Jesus giving encouragement to his disciples that, so if you think about what Jesus says to the Pharisees and the scribes, he says, you're going to kill them. Now, Jesus basically says here in Matthew 10, don't be afraid of those who kill you, but be afraid of the one who can not only kill you, but also, I would say it in this way, shut you out of the kingdom. That's what, in my opinion, destroying both body and soul in hell refers to, because we've already seen it with the weeping and gnashing of teeth and the weeds being bundled up and thrown into the fire. What is that? That's covenant judgment. So Jesus basically says, don't be the ones who are going to come under the fires of covenant judgment. And that's where I would go with that, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So is it okay to change the subject? Next subject?
Do it. Yeah, go for it.
All right. So Hebrews 6, it talks about the elementary things and the eternal judgment. What do you know what those elementary things were, and what is the eternal judgment that it's talking about in Hebrews 6?
Can you give me? I'm looking through it right now. Is it?
Bringing it up right now. Hebrews.
Oh, there it is. It's right in verse 2. Okay. Oh, yeah. So, therefore, let us leave the elementary doctrine of Christ and go on to maturity. So, maturity is a huge theme that Paul even utilizes. Growing up into the fullness of Christ. Okay. I'm just bringing stuff together because I think it would be, it's, again, we're talking about seminary level education. In terms of understanding what I'm going to say, it would take a long time for us to get through it. But if you think about maturity as wine aging, or as bread rising, so that when bread rises, it's maturing. when wine ferments and beer ferments, it's maturing. But history also matures. And we have to understand that is a part of the story that begins back in Genesis chapter 1, in my opinion. The days of creation are historical references, so that day 7 is the new covenant, and in a sense is the maturation of history. So if we think about Leviticus 23 has 7 festivals of God's acts of redemption. Well, they're not just simply God's acts of redemption in the past, but they're also anticipating the culmination of those stories in a telos, in an end, in a fruition, in a maturation, so that Paul says it this way, right? He says we need to move on to mature things and stop speaking like a child. When I was a child, I spoke as a child, right? That, I think, is a reference to Israel under the law. Israel under the law was a child. But the child is expected to grow up and mature and leave the law behind. And that's what Jesus is coming to do in the New Testament. That's what he says in his Sermon on the Mount, is the one who is wise will stop building his house on the law, but start building it on me. That's an aspect of maturity. So the elementary doctrine of Christ, I think, would be the Old Covenant. I think it would be the law, those elementary principles. So another metaphor that I've used is that the elementary principle is the yellow brick road, but they loved those laws. They loved not eating shellfish. They loved not doing this. They loved not doing that. They made the 6-year-old's bicycle with training wheels their goal. And Jesus brings a Harley Davidson and says, look at this. And they're like, nope, I got it. I love this bike. I grew up riding this bike. I'm going to keep it. And that's the stupidity of the elementary principles.
Yeah, that would tie into Paul calling the law a tutor.
Right. Yeah. Yep. But even then also with elementary aspects of the stoicheia, the elements of the world, the elements that are going to be burned up with fire, that is the law. That's the building. It's like I guess holding on to the blueprints for your house, and your house gets built, and you're like, no, I'm just going to sleep on the blueprints.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just stupid. We need to move on to maturity. We need to grow up. Not laying again a foundation of repentance from dead works and faith toward God, and instructions about washing, laying on of hands. All of those things are preparation in terms of information that is given to you in order so that when the new covenant comes and you recognize it, you know that you're supposed to leave those elementary things behind. And then what else did you ask about with that?
I was looking through it now. Yeah, the last one, eternal judgment.
Eternal judgment, right. Well, again, I mentioned already that ion in the Greek is the term for age, and ionos is the adjective that is usually translated as eternal. I don't think that eternal is helpful because of what our knee-jerk reaction to that is. So I don't know how I would alter it necessarily. Trying to think. The end of the age.
Age during, end of the age. Age during.
It would have to be.
If you go to Young's Living,
Yeah, it would have to be something that would be thematically and phonetically obvious, like, oh, this is totally related to the same idea because you're using, agedness or something like that, having to do with ages. Because if you have a concept in your mind of the fact that the ages are coming to fruition, the 6 days of the ages that God set up as history is culminating in the 7th age, is culminating in the 7th day. So it would have to be something like that. I wouldn't translate it eternal. Yeah, but it would be so weird sounding to us. It would be awkward. But as long as we have then defined it and we start to then use it in that fashion, it'll be familiar to us. And if we think about it in terms of the culmination of the story and the latter end and the end of days and all of that stuff would make sense, I think.
So, what is it? What do you think the eternal judgment was
it's
for
covenant,
Old
it's
Covenant Israel?
It's the judgment of the ages. I'm trying to think. I can't get the other verse in my mind. It's like it's on the tip of my tongue. I can't remember where it's in. I think it's probably in Matthew, where we already were looking at. But yeah, the judgment of the ages. I guess that's how I would translate it. That's how I would translate eternal in this situation. I would call it the judgment of the ages. So that it's, again, going back to Deuteronomy 32, God says, I wish that you would be wise so that you would see what your end would be. If you saw what you were doing and where it was going to lead you, you would stop. You would run to Christ for shelter. So that's the culmination. You know, it's I'm trying to think. For some reason, John 3:16 is coming to my mind. Let me see if that's... Yeah, so here's what I would say. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have the life of the ages.
Okay. And that eternal life reference there is to New Covenant. Basically, you have
right. It's
freedom from law, freedom from...
Yeah. Whoever believes in him should not perish, but have the life that the law was pointing towards. I mean, that would be like a huge paraphrase, right? But it's the life of the ages. Well, what ages? Again, going back to the Old Testament story, it's the story of time until the end of time. You know, the end of the times that God set up. And the perish there is not perishing in hell, but the eternal judgment, or the judgment of the ages, which is the opposite. Eternal judgment is the opposite of eternal life. The life of the ages, judgment of the ages, it's the same thing. Are you going to participate in the end? Yes, you are. How are you going to participate? Are you going to have life? Or are you going to be weeping and gnashing your teeth because you've been shut out of the kingdom? So then you think about that historically, that happened historically, and you had Jesus shutting the door with his ministry and the disciples shutting the doors with their ministry, where Paul, we can look in, the book of Acts, where Paul calls certain people to decision. I think was it Felix, who said, are you trying to make me a Christian? Can't remember if it was Herod or if it was Felix or Festus. But anyway, Paul says, I would that everyone would be, like me, except for these. You've gone mad, Paul. Your learning has made you mad. And Paul says, I would that everybody was like me, except for these chains, including you. He calls them to decision, and they either embrace it or they gnash their teeth and they stop their ears and they rush upon the messenger to eliminate the message. All of that stuff is thematically tied. We have to see the continuity in all of those stories. So then, when Paul talks about those things in Thessalonians, both 1 and 2, and he talks to the Thessalonians about the persecution, the affliction, the tribulation, because it's the same word that Jesus uses, and then when Paul in Corinthians in chapter 1, he uses the term end, the end. Well, what end is he talking about? What has informed Paul's end? Sam Frost will tell you that's the end of the world. No, it's Deuteronomy 32. It's the end of the story. And then you get that to 1 Corinthians 15, where we're talking about then the end will come. The end of what? Sam Frost will tell you it's the end of the world. No. That completely divorces it from the meta-narrative. It just does.
Right.
It just does, Sam Frost. But anyway, I digress.
Mm-hmm.
So eternal judgment is not eternal judgment. It's the judgment at the end of the age, which is the division of the wheat and the tares and the sheep and the goats. So the sheep and the goats, so the wheat and the tares are the same. The brood of vipers and the disciples, the older brother, the younger brother, all of that stuff, that's all the same story that started in Genesis chapter 4.
Okay. All right. The elements destroyed with fire. You mentioned that earlier, but do you want to speak on that for a second?
Sure. Again, it's, what is stoicheia? What is we can't introduce something that's not in anything previous to. So whenever we say this is what this passage means, I think the question should become, where does the justification for that interpretation come from? So if you think about Revelation chapter 20 Revelation 21, where I guess it is 20 as well, the new heavens and the new earth come down, right? Well, John says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. Well, where does he get that idea? Is he just making it up? Well, if we did a new heaven and a new earth kind of a word study, we would eventually find ourselves looking at Isaiah 65, where God says, behold, I create new heaven and a new earth. So are those two ideas supposed to be correlated by us? Should we see a connection between what John says and what Isaiah says? So when we read this in 2 Peter 3 about the elements burning up, we need, I think, to ask the question, well, what does stoicheia refer to? Peter's using it. It's not Paul, but are they thinking along the same lines? So here's thematically, right? Verse 9, chapter 3, verse 9, 2 Peter 3:9. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise. Okay, first of all, who's the Lord? Second of all, what promise? Right? Mm-hmm. He's not slow as some count slowness. Well, who are the some who are counting as slow? The scoffers, but back up in verse 3. Knowing, first of all, scoffers will come in the last days. Oh, that you would know your latter end. You're at the end of your days. This is Deuteronomy 32. Last days, Deuteronomy 32. They will say, where is the promise of his coming? So you can't separate verse 4 from verse 9. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise. What promise? The same promise the scoffers are mocking. What promise? The promise of his coming, his parousia. Right?
Right.
So, but he's patient with you, not wishing that any should perish. That's John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have the life of the ages. Well, when did the life of the ages culminate? In the first century. So when does the perishing culminate? In the first century. So when Peter says here, not wishing that any should perish, that's the same thing that Jesus says to the Pharisees and the scribes in Matthew 23 when he says, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, I would have gathered you as a hen. That's the same idea. Jesus says, I would that none of you would perish. I would that you were wise and that you would discern what your latter end is. But you guys are staying in the city. Excuse me. You're staying in the city. And you're going to die. Either physically by the Romans or covenantally by being shut out of the kingdom. To me, it's just what makes so much more sense. Because, I don't want to... It doesn't... My subjective experience doesn't make it correct, but I have so much more satisfaction reading the Bible as a preterist than I did when I was a futurist. There were just too many problems. I'm like, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense. So that's what we're talking about. Perishing is what we're talking about. Repentance leads to not perishing, which is the life of the ages. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. Where does Peter get that idea of coming like a thief? Matthew 24. So then, the coming like a thief in that day of the Lord is then associated right then in verse 10 with the following clause, then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth, well, I would say land, rather. I think that anytime, I don't know that earth should ever be translated that way, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Whenever you see the word earth, it should always be land because we're dealing with Israel. Right. And the works that are done on the land will be exposed. Okay, the works there is not a generic all of humanity trying to earn their way into God's good graces by their works. That is not what this is. This is talking about the elementary principles, the works of law that are supposed to lead to the life of the ages. But if you don't do the works the way that they're supposed to be done, then on that day, your methodology is going to be exposed, because either you're going to reject, either you're going to turn in the disciples, you're going to hand them over to the authorities, or you're going to hide them. You're going to preserve them. You're going to keep them safe, like Rahab, right? But so here in verse 10, we've got the day of the Lord will come like a thief. That's Matthew 24. The heavens passing away with a roar and the heavenly bodies being burned up and dissolved is Peter's, what's the word? His, what's the technical snotty word? His midrash, okay, his interpretation of what Jesus means by the stars falling from the sky and the sun not giving its light and the moon turning to blood red. So Peter doesn't say what Jesus says, but Peter says what Jesus says. You understand what I mean by that?
He gives his version of what he thinks.
Yeah.
Poetic version.
He basically, right. He basically he paraphrases and puts his spin on it in terms of saying the same thing that Jesus says. Okay, so since all of these things are going to be thus dissolved, that is, since the law is going to pass away, what sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness? Okay, so what is true holiness? What is true godliness? What is true righteousness? Jesus already told us back in the Sermon on the Mount. Your righteousness must surpass the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. Okay, listen, this is incredible. I haven't heard anybody say it this way. I hope that I'm right. It makes sense to me. But so when we see that, we see so many things that don't make sense, right? Salvation by works is not the way to go. You cannot save yourself by keeping the law. And yet, in two places that I can think of, Jesus says the exact opposite. In Matthew 5, he says, unless your righteousness passes the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. Well, how righteous were they? Man, they kept the law, right? They kept the law. And Jesus says, you're not going to be saved unless you're better than them. What?
Right.
What? Keep the law? What? We're not supposed to keep the law, Jesus. Wait a minute. Okay, and then he says in another place, I think it's Matthew 21 or 22, when the rich young man comes to him and says, what must I do to inherit the life of the ages? And Jesus says, keep the law. That's what he says.
Huh. What? Yeah.
Okay. And the guy says, well, I've done that since I was a kid. And then Jesus says, yeah, You got to keep the law by leaving it behind. Sell your riches, okay? He was rich in the law. He wasn't monetarily rich.
Oh.
Okay? He was rich in the law, and Jesus says the only way you're going to keep your riches is by leaving the law behind. But then that's what the rich young ruler did. He loved the yellow brick road. And he went away sad because he was rich in keeping the law. How do we know that? Because he said, I've done this since I was a kid, so I'm good, right? And Jesus goes, no, it's about me. You got to follow me. You got to move into me. And the guy's like, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. So going back, okay, long way around the barn. Going back to Matthew 5, when Jesus says, unless your righteousness surpasses the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, well, David, hopefully you should be able to tell me this answer. How do you do that?
Put your righteousness in Jesus, right?
That's right.
You leave the old covenant, you go into new covenant, then you're perfect. You're like the angels in heaven.
Yep. So living lives of holiness and godliness is moving into the kingdom, waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn. So again, the heavens are burning, but according to his promise, we are awaiting for the new heavens and the new earth. Again, doing the same question, where's Peter getting this idea of a new heavens and a new earth? What is that? Where we have to ask that question. Where is he getting this idea? And if we tie it back to Isaiah, then we have to say, okay, what is Isaiah talking about? Is he talking about a literal heaven and earth? No, he's not. Isaiah 65 clearly shows us the parallelism that when God says, behold, I create a new heaven and a new earth, and he says, behold, I create Jerusalem for rejoicing. So the heavens and the earth in that passage are associated with Jerusalem.
Yes. That was cool that you tied in the rich man with the law, upholding the law being, and that may tie in also to the rich man and Lazarus parable. Who is the rich man? He was one that was upholding the law.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
It could. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So the next question is, so just to summarize that one. So elements destroyed by fire could be like the elements of the law and the elements of the old covenant, the elements of all of that kingdom of darkness. That was right.
Yeah.
What was destroyed?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So why does the path to hell or why does the path to destruction? Do you want to summarize what that one actually means in its context?
When Jesus is talking about entering by the narrow gate.
Right. Yeah. Perfect. Narrow gate.
Where is that? Enter by the narrow gate. Is that Matthew 7? I think it's Matthew 7. Right at the end.
Matthew 7, yeah. They even put the highway to hell as broad. What is this?
Highway to hell!
Yes.
Yeah. What verse?
What translation is that?
I don't know. What verse are we at?
Highway to hell.
Yeah,
so the New Living Translation.
Oh, here it is.
The New Living Translation. Yeah, they put the highway to hell as broad. That's funny. All right. So what does it actually mean? Why does the path to destruction?
Okay. Well, we're talking again about the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, which is again and again and again about moving from darkness to light, moving past the righteousness of the Pharisees and being wise, right? So Deuteronomy 32, that they were wise, that they would see what their end would be. And so you have that theme in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. So it's all tied together. Everything in here is tied together. And I would encourage everyone to go to both my website, which is rethinkingrevelation.com, and you can click on This Explains More, which is my co-host's blog, Jonathan Sedlak. I think his blog is thisexplainsmore.com, I think. So you can either go that way, or if I'm wrong and it's not thisexplainsmore.com, go to Rethinking Revelation and look up This Explains More as a tab. Click that, and it will be hyperlinked. And Jonathan has...
It is. Yeah, it's thisexplainsmore.com.
Yeah, okay. Jonathan has numerous, richly deep, so good. He works through the Sermon on the Mount, and if you, yeah, he'll blow you away. That's a fantastic new devotion for you to dive into. Okay, so all of that going into,
what is the path to destruction? What was the path to destruction?
Well, yeah,
on the path?
We're still talking about the same thing. We're still talking about the same
Okay.
thing. Destruction, perishing, fire, it's all the same thing. It doesn't change. You know, so we've got, instead of wheat and tares, we have in verses 15 and following, a healthy tree and a diseased tree. We have grapes and thorn bushes, figs, thistles. You know, that's the same contrast, right? Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father. What does that mean, doing the will? Does that mean like obeying the law and not ever murdering or not ever lying or not? No, it's not. The will of the Father is to move into the new covenant.
Right, that was the
On that day,
yeah.
On that day, what day? On what day? What day are we talking about? You know, so got to go back and look at that. You know what? For some reason I thought that the narrow gate was in the passage I'm looking at right now, but it's actually above in verses 12 and 13, right? So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. So you're asking me again about the narrow gate and is that it? I don't see that.
Yeah, well,
I don't see
what would
hell.
be the wide?
I don't see hell.
No, it leads to destruction. But like we just read, New Living Translation says, "Wide is the highway to hell." You know, instead of leads to destruction. And in context, it would be talking about what they were going to be facing in AD 70 and all that. And so if we just want to unpack that a little bit, so what is the narrow gate would be?
Yeah, I suppose. Let's try to think. I wish that Jesus would simply just use one metaphor the entire time, instead of so many different metaphors. But if you think back to, or not back to, but ahead, I would just say that it's analogous to what he says about being wise and building one's house on a rock. So you might think of the foolish man builds his house on the sand, and that's easy, because you can just push your tent pegs down into the sand. But with a rock, you've got to maybe bore out some holes and, anchor down, and it's more difficult and it takes a lot more effort. So you've got that contrast of it's easier to build your house on sand than it is on the rock. But then when you build your house on the rock, it's building your house on the words of Christ. And so then if you go back to entering, the gate is wide. The gate being wide is parallel to building your house on sand. It's easy. Everybody does that. There's a lot more people that are going to be doing that. So I would like to think that all of the stuff that we've talked about could be simply, run through the grid of what we're seeing here. I don't think we really have to itemize each of these things. What does it mean that the gate is wide and the gate is narrow, and there are a few that find it. There are many who, the many are the weeds. The many are the thistles. The many are the. It's still the same theme. It's all the same theme in terms of judgment and life. But what's interesting is I don't think that we should miss this. I think that it's interesting that Jesus talks about the flood coming in verse 27, when the rains fell and the floods came. I think that that's a direct allusion back to Noah. I think that the story of Noah is eschatologically talking about the new covenant, which is why Jesus uses a flood imagery here, because that's the judgment that's coming. So that the ark, again, I'm going to mix my metaphors, but just like Jesus says in Matthew 13, that the kingdom grows and the birds of the air take their refuge in the branches, that's the same thing as the nations which are depicted as animals as taking their shelter in the ark, so that the ark is the tree of the metaphor of the mustard seed, and the birds of the air. We see that, like I said before, the birds of the air in Ezekiel are the nations.
All right. So now let me tell you where we're at, and you can decide how much more effort and how much more time you want to put into this. But we're at number 6. I've got 23 questions and then keywords, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So we can stop now.
I would say my throat is actually really dry.
Okay.
But I think we probably could. Go ahead.
We blotted out of the Book of Life. If you want to do that now or next time, if you want to string through what that meant, it will be.
It's a register. It's a register. Moses does the same thing where he asks God not to blot him out of the book. It's not a once saved, always saved idea. It's not you can lose your salvation kind of an idea. It's the old covenant and the new covenant motif. But I'm trying to think. I think the book of Daniel has a reference to it, and I can't think of it off the top of my head. But I'm convinced that the book of life is a register of those who leave the yellow brick road for the new covenant. So in a sense, everyone who is in Israel has their name written in the book of life. But you can't, because it's part of Israel's story, you can have your name eliminated when you don't leave the yellow brick road for the kingdom. And that's what we see in Revelation 21, where the books are opened, and you've got two different accounts. Accounts are records of those who have moved into and those who have refused to move into, and you are repaid according to the works of the law, which is not works salvation, but it's the fact that you actually lived in accordance with what the law was truly about, and that is, did you move into Christ or did you refuse to move into Christ? And so, if you think about it that way, I think it makes more sense that when you are judged according to your works, it's like what Jesus says in Matthew 7 about the trees bearing fruit. You know a tree by its fruit. That's the same thing as being judged according to your works. You're being judged according to your fruit. And are you producing rotten fruit, or are you producing leaves that are healing for the nations? So when it just makes so much more sense when Jesus says all throughout Matthew, I am going to render according to each man his works, what his works, produce. That's what he's talking about. He's like, I am going to, enter into my kingdom. That's what he says in Matthew 25 with the sheep and the goats, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there you go. So the contrast of what the works of the law produce is those who protected the disciples, those who gave them cups of water, those who visited them in prison and whatnot. That's the works of the law. That's the depiction of what that is. And the goats are like, what? The goats are like, what? We never knew. What do you mean? When did we see you? And Jesus is like, yeah, you don't see. You don't see.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting your just desserts.
Travis, thank you. Thanks for sending. You spent quite a bit of time. That was a lot of talking and stuff. I appreciate you doing that. And if you want to continue the rest of the list, just let me know if you want to schedule a time and do that. Or Miano has offered to help, and I can get some help if it's something that if it's a big deal to be able to stay on the phone for an hour and answer any questions. Just let me know.
I'm more than happy to, if you come across an opportunity to talk to Michael or anybody else and cover other questions, that's fine with me. Whatever. So I'm always from Monday through Friday, and sometimes on a Saturday I'm on the road driving, so I've got nothing to do but talk if you want. So
yeah, we'll connect again for sure then.
Okay.
Do you have any questions for me? I've been asking you a million questions. So
no.
Do you have anything for me?
No. I'm beat. I'm gonna go.
Are you ready to end the call?
Yeah.
My question.
I'm gonna jump on Netflix and finish a Robert Redford movie that I started.
Right on. Okay.
So.
All right. Take care, brother. Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Good. Yeah. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Talk to you next time. See ya.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
All right, since the recording of that episode last week, I've talked to David, and we're going to try to set up a follow-up session, so keep your ear out for that. As always, check us out on Facebook and Twitter, Rethinking Revelation, or rethinkingrevelation.com, and visit that website for other past episodes, articles, and John Sedlak's blog, thisexplainsmore.com. There's a SpeakPipe app there at rethinkingrevelation.com where you can click that and leave an audio question, comment, challenge, disagreement, whatever. Hope to hear from you. This is Travis Finley with Rethinking Revelation. Until next time.